All right, guys, we're moving on to 12.2 today, describing data collection. There's a few important terms that you're going to need to know. So you are going to have to know that an attribute. You're going to have to know that an attribute is a property or characteristic that is being measured. So some different attributes could be length, it could be color, it could be height, it could be weight. It is whatever you are measuring, okay? So we describe data collections by the attribute. So what are we measuring? How many times we have observed the measurements, okay? The unit of measure. So if you are measuring weight, how did you measure the weight? Did you use a scale? If you're measuring height, what did you use? Did you use centimeters, meters? Oh, and height would be, inches, feet. Means by which the measurements were made. So this case, you would say, if you're measuring weight, you would say, I used a scale. If you're measuring height, you might say, I used a measuring stick, okay? And how many times did you make this observation? So for instance, Mrs. Prusich's class has 28 kids in the class. If I were taking the height of each student in my class, the attribute would be height of 6th grade. The unit of measure, I would measure you in inches. The means I would measure you in, I would use probably a tape measure. And the number of observations, there would be 28 because there are 28 of you, okay? So when we describe the data set, we are going to look at those 4 things. So looking at our data set, so somebody measured some garnets, okay? They measured, there were 12 observations, okay? Garnet 1 through 6 is here, garnet 1 through 12 is there, and they measured their mass or their weight. So the attribute measured was the weight, or we'll say mass because that's what they have up there, the mass of each garnet. The unit used to measure the mass, well, they measured them in grams. So that is the unit. To measure mass in grams, well, how do you measure weight? You usually put it on a scale. So that would be the way the measurement was taken. You're just gonna have to use your best judgment on that. Okay, and the number of observations he made, well, he measured how many garnets? 12. So the number of observations Jeffrey made on these garnets was 12. Okay. Question 1, would Jeffrey have gotten the same data set if he had measured a different group of garnets? Explain. Well, the answer there, boys and girls, is probably not. Because, as you can see from the data set, each garnet weighed a different amount. So if he chose 10 completely different garnets, he was probably, gonna have a different group of, or a different set of data. Sorry, I'm just gonna run over here. All right, what other attributes could he have measured? Remember attributes, or what are they measuring? So he could have measured their length, he could have measured their color, he could have measured length, color, he could have measured clarity. So there are several other attributes Jeffrey could have looked at, but in this case, the attribute he chose was mass. Okay, I'm gonna skip over page 656, and I'm gonna look at share and show so we can just get a little bit more practice. Okay, share and show says describe the data set by listing the attribute measured, the unit of measure, the likely means of measurement, and the number of observations. So boys and girls, you're gonna need 5 things for each one of these. So, 4 things, excuse me. You're gonna need the attribute, the unit of measure, the way they measured it, and how many times the observation was made. So here's Greg's 100-meter race results. So what are they measuring? Well, they measured the time it took him to run each race. The unit of measure, they measured it in seconds. How do you usually time something? Well, I usually use a stopwatch. My computer's acting up again. Always. And how many times was this observation made? There were 7 races, so he made 7 observations. Okay. This next one, the Andrews family water use, so it's right over here. So we need 4 things. Remember the first thing being attribute. I wonder if I could just type if that would make it a little bit faster for you guys. Hopefully, huh? Maybe. So the attribute, so while I'm getting ready for this to pop up, the attribute was what is he measuring? He's measuring water usage. So attribute is water usage. Okay, the next thing, the unit of measure. Well, what did they measure it in? They measured in gallons. Okay, how are they going to measure it? Most of the time, any water measurement is done by a water meter. So likely measurement tool is a water meter. And how many observations? So number of observations. So you would count how many days did they do this for? Well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14. So there were 14 observations. Okay.